Good morning and welcome, friends. This particular lodge holds a meeting every Sunday at 11 a.m. For the discussion of a particular topic presented by a student, followed by question and answers. Every first and third Sundays of the month, we're studying the Key by H.P. Blavatsky. The Theosophical movement of the 19th century, which was presented to the Western world, primarily, presented in book form all the knowledge that could be given to the humanity at that stage of development. We have now moved into the 21st century, but that the current started during that period will still continue for the whole of the next 2,000 years, because that movement goes with cyclic return, and this is the Aquarian age. And so the philosophy given to the world at that time started the change in the manas of humanity, which will continue till the end of this cycle. In the next, which is the fifth round, mind is then going to express itself without any hindrance from matter. So it behooves us to read the suggestions made in the philosophy as to how we are to bring about this change in ourselves, and hence become role models for all those who will follow. The pledge states that the policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the Theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy and the exemplification in practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis, and it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. Today's reading comes from the Upanishad, Aranyaka Upanishad. He who acts in accordance with Tao becomes one with Tao. He who treads the path of virtue becomes one with virtue. He who pursues a course of vice becomes one with vice. The man who is one with Tao, Tao is also glad to receive. The man who is one with virtue, virtue is also glad to receive. The man who is one with vice, vice is also glad to receive. He who is self-approving does not shine. He who boasts has no merit. He who exalts himself does not rise high. Judge according to Tao, he is like remnants of food or a tumor on the body. an object of universal disgust. Therefore, one who has da will not consort with such. Perfect virtue acquires nothing, therefore it obtains everything. Perfect virtue does nothing, yet there is nothing which it does not effect. Perfect charity operates without the need of anything to evoke it. Perfect duty to one's neighbor operates, but always needs to be evoked. Perfect ceremony operates and calls for no outward response. Nevertheless, it induces respect. Ceremonies are the outward expression of inward feelings. If da perishes, then virtue will perish. If virtue perishes, then charity will perish. If charity perishes, then duty to one's neighbor will perish. If duty to one's neighbor perishes, then ceremonies will perish. Ceremonies are but the veneer of loyalty and good faith, while ofttimes the source of disorder. Knowledge of externals is but a showy ornament of da, while ofttimes the beginning of imbecility. Therefore, the truly great man takes his stand upon what is solid, and not upon what is superficial, upon what is real, and not upon what is ornamental. He rejects the latter in favor of the former. Now today's talk, why 7?
Hi friends, welcome to today's discussion on the number and the meaning of 7. There has always been a deep significance attached to numbers in antiquity. There was not a people or a civilization, those that had philosophy, but gave a great prominence to numbers in their application to all facets of life. The establishment of festival days, of symbols, geographical distributions of things, markets and commodities, etc. The numerical system of Pythagoras was nothing novel when it appeared earlier than 600 BC. And the occult meaning of figures and their combinations entered into the meditations of the sages of every peoples. And the day is not far off when, compelled by the eternal cyclic rotation of events, our now skeptical, unbelieving West will have to admit that in regular periodicity of ever-recurring events, there is something more than a mere blind chance. Already, scientists and savants are beginning to notice it. With that, we want to talk about some of the examples of the ancients and 7, the different meanings of 7, and how we get to 7. Obviously, it's a progression. It's more than 1. It's less than other numbers. How do we get to 7? What is its significance? Why is it considered such a sacred and important number? The number 7 was considered sacred not only by all the cultured nations of antiquity in the East, but was held in the greatest reverence even by the later nations in the West. The astronomical origin of this number is established beyond any doubt. Man, feeling himself time out of mind dependent upon the heavenly powers, ever and everywhere made earth subject to heaven. The largest and brightest of the luminaries thus became in his sight the most important and highest of powers. Such were the planets to which the whole antiquity numbered as 7. There are 7 sacred planets. The Egyptians had 7 original and higher gods. The Phoenicians had 7 Kabiris. The Persians, 7 sacred horses of Mithra. The Parsis, 7 angels opposed by 7 demons. There were 7 celestial abodes paralleled by 7 lower regions. By way of example, in the worship of Mithra, there were 7 gates, 7 altars, 7 mysteries. The priests of many Oriental nations were subdivided into 7 degrees. 7 steps led to altars in the temples, burnt candles in 7 branched candlesticks. Even Masonic lodges to this day have 7 or 14 steps, a multiple of 7. China was divided into 7 provinces. Ancient Persia and Arabia also had 7,000 angels and just 7s everywhere. Whether it's a pagan tradition, a Christian tradition, 7 is ubiquitous. I want to read something about 7. To attempt to cite all the things included in this mystical number would require a library. So we could go on and more will come up. But it may be said, to go back to the 7 sacred planets, that each planet serves as a form of focus through which the energies of the 7 rays reach us and our planet Earth. So there's 7 rays. And these rays come from the Logos. The Logos breaks up into, it's said, the light. There's 7 rays, and from each ray there is a progenitor. So there's 7 progenitors. And every person is said to belong under one or another. So there's 7 rays, there's 7 colors. To each color there's a sound. There's a scale composed of, 7 notes, especially in India. Apollo had a 7-stringed lyre which he played and represented mystical sounds, the music of the spheres, but all arranged in a 7. Continuing with the idea of these distinct ray groups of human monads, just back up a second. There are 7 planets specially connected with the Earth, and the possible combinations of those with the zodiac, the possible combinations of their aspects are countless. Hello. HPB quotes Subarao about these 7 ray groups. Every Buddha meets at his last initiation all the great adepts who reached Buddhahood during the preceding ages. Every class of adepts has its own bond of spiritual communion which knits them together. The only possible and effectual way of entering into such a brotherhood is by bringing one's self within the influence of the spiritual light which radiates from one's own logos. I may further point out here that such communion is only possible between persons whose souls derive their life and sustenance from the same divine ray, and that as 7 distinct rays radiate from the central spiritual sun, all adepts in Dian Chohans are divisible into 7 classes, each of which is guided, controlled, and overshadowed by one of the 7 forms or manifestations of divine wisdom. One's own logos here means a particular one of the 7 Dhyani Buddhas, or 7 rays, of which one is a ray and a reflection on earth. Souls derive their life and sustenance from one of the divine rays, or primeval monads, or 7 primordial 7 elements, the 7 forms of manifestation of the divine wisdom. Because all human beings are divisible into 7 classes corresponding to these, so are all adepts in Dian Chohan, since they too are human beings or have been human beings. So these 7 logoi, or 7 sons of light, are the emanators of the monads destined to become human in that cycle. And as was mentioned, these 7 themselves proceed from the spiritual planes, the arupa to the rupa. So everything becomes a reflection of the 7. And how do we get to 7, and what more is the significance of 7? But this is part of the reason why it's the sacred number that it is, because the very manifestation of our spiritual principles, one could say, proceeds on a 7-fold basis. We know that in Theosophy we are 7-fold beings. We have 7 principles, and we'll touch on that. Each human monad is born, or rather begins the whole cycle of its incarnation in one manvantara under one of the 7 sons of light. It's literally part of the essence of one of those 7 suns, or 7 Dhyani Buddhas, or 7 primordial rays, if one really prefers the term. And it will remain forever its monad star throughout the whole cycle. The human monads on our earth exist in 7 different groups, corresponding to these rays or hierarchies. As was stated, the 7 sons of light are not the same as the 7 sacred planets, nor do they live in or inhabit them, but they precede and transcend the planets. So we should really put the planets down here. Because anything physical is a reflection of something more spiritual, because spirit evolves into matter. But instead, these 7 sons of light precede and transcend the planets while maintaining a sacred essential connection with and through them. And they furnish us with our monads, our spiritual faculties. So I'm going to touch on some points in the Secret Doctrine, and we'll list some more 7s and how we get to 7. There's a really great bit in the Secret Doctrine on 7 called The Mysteries of the Hebdomad, and it's in the 2nd volume of the Secret Doctrine. It goes from approximately pages 590 to like 630. Definitely worth reviewing. And we'll touch on it. So the esoteric doctrine treats that we come from 7, and that when the first 7 appeared on earth, they threw the seed of everything that grows on the land into the soil. And this is like metaphorically speaking. First came the 3, and 4 were added to these as soon as stone was transformed into plant. Then came the second 7, who, guiding the monads of the plants, produced the intermediate nature between plant and animal, and so on. And this is called, thus man became a Saptaparna. And this means a 7-leaved plant. And this is referring to the principles. It says that 3 came down and were added to the 4. And this is where we get the 7 principles. We know that the 3 highest principles, Atma Buddhi Manas, are immortal, that go from life to life. And the 4 below are the material principles, part of the formation of the material vehicle of those principles. So the astral body, the life energy, the physical body, and those things. So what this is really saying is that man is a 7-leaved plant. He's a combination of spiritual and material factors that make up who we are, and that the minerals and so forth are below us. They're not a 7-leaved plant. They're, a 3 or a 4. So I'm going to pass out something in the Secret Doctrine. It's a chart, and it's got the principles the human principles and the principles of physical nature. And the Atma Buddhi Manas is above, and then we're going to talk about the 4 below. You can look at it until we get to it. So, the intelligible world proceeds out of the divine mind in this manner, from this 3 to 4. We have this symbol of the 7, which is the triangle above the square. And in another article on symbology called Theosophical Symbols by Judge, he talks about not just the symbols, but how we get to the different numbers and so forth. Let's see. He says, in Theosophical Symbolism, the number 7 has, ever since the Theosophical Society was founded, played a prominent part in all its affairs. And as usual, the symbols which particularly relate or pertain to the society are in number 7. And he lists the 7 symbols, like the sacred seal of Theosophy, the serpent biting its tail, and the seal, and so forth. But it was no secret that it was based on 7, and it's because of this reflection from the spiritual, the esoteric wisdom that was brought forth during the Theosophical movement. So, Saptaparna is the name given in occult phraseology to man. It means, as shown elsewhere, a 7-leaved plant, and the name has great significance in the Buddhist legends. So it had also under disguise in the Greek myths. In Greek, the letter gamma, the cross and the circle, was a symbol of life and of life eternal, because the gamma is the symbol of the earth, Gaia, and of life eternal. 7 is the symbol of the same life linked with divine life, the double glyph expressed in these geometric figures. So to get to where did the 3 and the 4 come from? We know that the cosmogony of our system, of the Theosophy teaches, occultism teaches, is that there's a blank disk, and then there appears a dot, and that's the first manifestation from the one, from the unconditioned absolute, and this forms a line, and that's a 1, and then the male line and the female line. So here we get 4, but also the thing about symbology is that there's not just one way to look at it. There's always different permutations, and it's just showing like another aspect, like a jewel has different facets, a different aspect of the wisdom. They're all true. So we have to have the male and the female in order to make generation. And if we look at the human principles, Atma Buddhi Manas, it is said to proceed in this direction, the light from the logos, and there's a triangle formed. So from the 0 is produced the 1, and then there's 2, the binary, and then from the mother-father, we know, like, it's called mother-father produces. I mean, that's what the reflection in the physical world happens, is that generation can occur. And from 2 comes 3. And then from the triangle, the three-dimensional figure of this is a tetrad, or a pyramid. And the pyramid is important because first came 3, the triangle. This expression has a profound meaning in occultism, and the fact is corroborated in mineralogy, botany, and even geology. Ancient chronology by the compound number 7, the 3 and the 4 being in it. Even salt in solution proves it, for when its molecules clustered together begin to deposit themselves as a solid, the first shape they assume is that of triangles, of small pyramids and cones. It is the figure of fire, whence the word pyramid, because P-Y-R is fire. While the second geometrical figure in manifested nature is a square or a cube, a 4. For the particles of earth being cubical, those of the fire are pyramidal. And so the pyramid shape is that assumed, for example, by pine trees, the most primitive tree after the fern. So it's reflected in nature. Thus, the two opposites in cosmic nature, fire and water, heat and cold, begin their metrographical manifestations. In other words, producing all things. And that's where this comes in. The triangle is the upper principles, and then the 4 is composed of these principles. And on Earth, we could say that the element that corresponds to the principle. For the Kamarupa, the hydrogen corresponds. The lightest of all gases, it burns in oxygen, giving off the most intense heat of any substance in combustion and forming water. The most stable. Hydrogen enters into all organic compounds. And then the linga sharira is nitrogen, an inert gas, the vehicle with which oxygen is mixed to adapt the latter for animal respiration. And it also enters into largely into all organic substances. Prana, or life, corresponds with oxygen, the supporter of combustion, the life-giving gas, just like prana is a life-giving energy, the chemical agent in all organic life. And lastly, carbon, the gross matter of the body, the physical body, the substance formed and molded over the astral body, the fuel par excellence, carbon is. It's the basis of all organic substances. So even when the ancients and HPB is talking about the triangle and the square, if one understands the full symbolism on all the levels of number 7, and understands all the correspondences, like the material elements that go with it, they can see that this makes, the fire and the water is the creator of life. Not just physical, but symbolically on other planes as well. And she illustrates that in the Secret Doctrine. As far as opening our minds and understanding the 7 from many different planes, she says that for the comprehension of the occult doctrine is based on that of the 7 sciences, which sciences find their expression in 7 different applications of the secret records to every exoteric text. Thus, we have to deal with modes of thought on 7 entirely different planes of ideation. Every text relates to and has to be rendered from one of the following standpoints. The realistic plane of thought, the idealistic plane of thought, and the purely divine or spiritual. So whenever we come face to face with a symbol, we can think of it in maybe its physical correlations, mental and spiritual correlations. And the more we do that, the easier it'll get. At first, it's sort of like, how do we do that? But the Secret Doctrine leads us through these steps. The other planes too far transcend the average consciousness, especially of the materialistic mind, to admit of their being even symbolized in terms of ordinary phraseology. For it is either symbolical, the mode of thought in which they are originally written has to be found out and closely adhered to during the process of interpretation. It's either symbolical, emblematical, which are, ancient modes of thought, parabolical, hieroglyphical, or logogrammical. And these are different modes of thought in which to interpret symbols. So again, those are symbolical is an archaic mode of thought, emblematical is later though very ancient, parabolical is like an allegory, and as we've said, as above, so below, so many times. Hieroglyphical or logogrammical, the most difficult of all, as every letter in the Chinese language represents a whole word. Thus, almost every proper name, whether in the Vedas or wherever, is composed of logograms. And no one who is not initiated into the mystery of the occult religious logography, can presume to know what a name in any ancient fragment means before he has mastered the meaning of every letter that composes it. So that's just by way of understanding that there are many levels on which to look at each symbol. Another interesting thing about the progenitors and generation is that it often occurs in sevens. And it's said that even in the animals, their processes have 1 or more weeks of septenates as their periods. The gestation of mammals, the duration of fevers, etc. The eggs of the pigeon are hatched in 2 weeks or 14 days. Those of the fowl in 3. Those of the duck in 4. Those of the goose in 5, and so on. We know that in human beings, it's 9 months, but it's said that the baby can actually, it's been perfected by 7 months, but the 8th and 9th month are to give it strength and perfect it for, breathing, oxygen, and so forth. But the formation is finished within 7. And it's usually 40 to 42 weeks of generation. Again, a multiple of 7. And she lists further examples, just to show that the physical generation is patterned after a spiritual archetype. The number 7 as a compound of 3 and 4 is, she says, the factor element in every religion because it is the factor element in nature. So everything is based on it. And everything is in sevens because being itself entirely out of human reckoning or calculation, this huge aggregation of various states of consciousness that we're capable of is a septenate in its totality, entirely composed of septenary groups, simply because the capacity of perception exists in 7 different aspects corresponding to the 7 conditions of matter, or the 7 properties or states of conditions of matter. And that would correspond probably with the principles. That would probably correspond with any other septenate in nature. The sound, the vibration, the auditory, the color, etc. And therefore, number 1 down to number 7 begins in the esoteric calculations with the first manifested principle, which is number 1, if we commence from above, and the 7th when reckoning from below. Another example of how the 7 figures prominently is that once we get from, the 3 and the 4, and everything material takes on this, square, this cube, 3-dimensional form, the cube unfolded, whoops, my squares aren't good, is this. And while it looks like 6, if one counts down 4 and then 3, one gets 7. And she said it's the cube unfolded is the 6 with the spirit makes 7 the perfect, the perfect, complete spiritual entity. Because the universe requires spirit to vivify matter. So that's another example. The significance of 4 is that the Pythagoreans called it the keeper of nature, but in union with the 3 it makes 7 the most perfect and harmonious number, nature herself. The intelligible world proceeds out of the divine mind after this manner. The tetractys, or the 4, reflecting upon its own essence, the first unit, producer of all things, and on its own beginning, saith thus: Once one, twice two, immediately ariseth a tetrad, having on its top the highest unit, and becomes a pyramis, whose base is a plain tetrad, having on its top the highest unit, answerable to superficies upon which the radiant light of the divine unity produceth the form of incorporeal fire, by reason of the descent of matter to inferior things. Hence ariseth essential light, not burning light, but illuminating light. This is the creation of the middle world, which the Hebrews called the supreme, the world of their deity. It is termed Olympus, entirely light and replete with separate forms, where is the seat of the immortal gods, whose top is unity, its wall trinity, and its superficies quaternity. And that was a lot. We'll just let that gel. From when it becomes three-dimensional, it's these superficies that gain like dimension and just in case. The superficies would remain a meaningless surface if left by itself. Unity only illuminating quaternity, the famous lower 4, has to build for itself a wall from Trinity if it would be manifested. And that's pretty philosophically deep. People can review that if they want on page 601 of the second volume of the Secret Doctrine. The number 7, the Pythagoreans considered to be a religious and perfect number, because by it, all in the universe and mankind is led to its end, its culmination. Being under the rule of 7 sacred planets, the doctrine of the spheres shows, from Lemuria to Pythagoras, the 7 powers of terrestrial and sublunary nature, as well as the 7 great forces of the universe, proceeding and evolving in 7 tones, which are the 7 notes of the musical scale. The heptad, our septenary, was regarded as the number of a virgin because it is unborn, like the logos, without a father or mother, but proceeding directly from the monad, which is the origin and crown of all things. Thus, the septenary was sacred to many gods and goddesses, to Mars with his 7 attendants, Osiris, whose body was divided into 7, Apollo, the sun, the 7 planets, and it can go on and on. There's just so many examples. So these 7 rays that everything is from are from 7 centers of energy that are evolved or rendered objective by the action of Fohat upon the one element, or in fact the 7th principle of the 7 elements which exist throughout manifested cosmos. And then there's an example of the Egyptian 7 principles next to the Indian esoteric 7 principles, which again, the names are even really similar. So if one really looks, one can find the 7 is ubiquitous in every religious tradition, in every society that had a philosophy. 7 figures prominently, and it's because everything's based on 7. And I hope I provided enough examples for you to, have some questions and see some connections with all the different 7s. Anybody have a question? I know that was a lot, but yeah.
I think it's on page 82 of the Secret Doctrine. HPB gives the primary constitution, which correlates to this diagram you gave out of the Diane Johan. Perhaps you might want to interject that into it.
Yeah.
It's helpful, the primaries.
Yeah, and
it's at the bottom of page 82, I think.
And the progression from the plain disk and then the disk with a dot in it, all the way up to, the 4, the cube, the 5 is a star.
Yeah.
The star with a dot in it is 6. She does that in the proem, and that's worth looking at too.
She correlates these hydrogen, nitrogen to the Diane Johan, so it actually shows that the elements also come from these entities, Diane Johanic hosts that you listed as our spiritual progenitors. So they give the impulse to the universal elements or atomic forces as well. I'm sorry, I think it is on 82, but I don't remember.
Of volume 1?
Yeah, I think so. It's at the bottom there. It's
Yeah,
like
the great cosmic elements, Akashic, ethereal, watery, and fiery, for want of better terms.
Yeah, and then she lists them as hydrogenic, paraoxygenic, and so forth.
Yeah, oxyhydrogenic, ozonic, nitro-ozonic. The latter forces or gases being the most effective and active when energizing on the plane of more grossly differentiated matter. They're both electropositive and electronegative. Wow, good memory.
Is that 82?
Yes.
82, volume 1, yeah.
Yeah, because those are necessary components for our health. The atomic structure of the 7 principles come from them. And this harmony is what really this is.
Yeah, if they're not in balance.
Imbalance, right? Harmony. But, yeah.
I know, there's so much, and probably, I don't know, maybe touched on too much, but just trying to give as much of an overview and examples as possible. It's also said that humans progress in periods of 7 years. Like the child, the mind is lit up and the child becomes reasoning and reasonable at age 7 when the being's fully incarnated. At 14 is a big change, at the time of puberty and the beginning of adolescence, some direction is chosen in life perhaps. 21 is the end of growth, and 28, full adulthood, and then at 35 it says that the materials are constantly, of the physical, are building upon themselves, but at 35 that process starts to reverse as we age, so that there isn't as much rebuilding. It's nature's taking that arc, and now it's more trying to keep itself going because nature starts to tear down little by little. And so there's a significance to like every 7-year period in one's life. 42 and then 49 having completed 7 sevens.
But, in that article you quoted from, I think she calls them devourers and builders, but they're composed of the same elemental structures. It just depends what use we put into. But it's amazing that that consecutive sevens played a tremendous effect on bringing the devourers into prominence. 49. After 35, it starts
To
that process.
accelerate.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a natural course, obviously, that we take through life.
Yeah, it's built on cycles and
Did you, if I may follow with another comment, did you come across in your research for the topic that the synthesis is a spiritual, that if you reach that, then all the rest becomes clear? In other words, you can do the progression in sevens, going higher and higher through the initiation process that you mentioned. But if you go directly to the spiritual, in other words, if you cultivate your spiritual nature, then all of that is listed underneath it becomes available to you. Did you see that?
yeah, you worded it very well. Yeah.
So then, if the mind is part of the higher triad, then it behooves us to truly cultivate the higher mind, does it not?
Yes, because we don't really know who we are. We have, there's a sense associated with every, a principle and a sense that is developed with every round in these great cycles, and we haven't, they aren't all awakened in us yet because we're not all the way through. But those who devote themselves to this science, to in a sense of unity, purity, and charity, can accelerate that process. I mean, the mass of humanity will get to the highest level at the end of the 7th round, where it's said we'll all be like Buddhas. But those who focus on this can bring it about earlier. Hence, there are those beings who've already achieved Buddhahood. And it's said that there is a Buddha that comes for each, there's 7, and one comes during each round. It just goes on. There's more examples that are really interesting and fascinating.
So what you said, this 7, this concept of 7, permeates through virtually everything, if I understand it correctly. And that we talked about kind of inferno cycles. We have cycles which sound rather mechanical, but we have an influence on those cycles as to, the qualitative aspect of them, if I understood you correctly.
Absolutely. I mean, if
We don't get that on a day-to-day basis except in
right,
a situation like this.
as we know at this stage of our development, because mind is awake, we have to, through self-induced and self-devised efforts. Buddhahood is not handed to you on a platter. Even if one with the great mass of humanity just proceeds naturally, it still requires self-induced and self-devised efforts. Why not help the mass of humanity by leavening the entire, like the yeast in the loaf of bread, a little bit leavens the whole thing. And HPB says that we're at a critical transition because our intellectual capacity is advanced enough that we can cause ourselves real harm. And we need the philosophy with its underpinning of metaphysics and ethics wedded together to take the next step forward. Something that I just thought of is that the triangle symbolizes the light, and the cube or the square corresponds to life. Light and life equals union. And we could say unity a complete being, so this is how the 3 that plus 4 equals 7. It's not a complete, it's not a complete entity. You know, the 7 is the perfect reflection of the archetypal, you know, the 7 progenitors and the seven Buddhas. It's even said that when one becomes a Buddha, one meets all those who've become Buddhas before, which was interesting that it was in this section that the student found that. It was very interesting. Because I guess they all fall under one of those 7 categories or groupings, for lack of a better word. What do I do? Go ahead.
Can you talk about numbers in general? We focus on 7, but how do we, you know, the student's understanding is every number has deeper meanings. Every number is divine in itself. So can you talk about how to observe numbers, how to interpret numbers in general?
That's a good question.
Secret Doctrine is what he's talking about.
Yeah. Basically, well, in the proem, in the Secret Doctrine, she shows how to get from 0 to 10, the first 10 numbers. And in some esoteric traditions, it said that 10 is the perfect number because there's a super sensuous, I don't know, even, you know, higher levels of spirituality. But basically everything's built on 7s. But she shows, and I didn't do a very good job about how it starts with no thing but everything.
Vertical.
Yeah. Oh, the vertical comes first?
Well, the dot comes first. Then.
Yeah, the dot comes first. And that's 0, and then the dot is the first differentiation, and
Vertical. That's 10. Because
That's-
the 1 is in it.
the 0 and 1 also make 10. And then, you know, everything that's implicit in 10, 5, 4, everything that adds up to 10 is necessarily a part of this when you examine the symbol in its totality or from different points of view. And because there's something and not something else, we get to 2. There's duality. There can't be something without its opposite. Good and evil, light and dark, heat and cold. It's forever the way of things that there's this duality. And from that, there's produced generation. There's from 2 and 1, the duality plus unity equals, you know, it's like Trinity, yeah, mother, father, son, so to speak. And then using these combinations of numbers, we can get every other number. So in terms of thinking of it, you know, philosophically, of actually looking at these symbols, as she said, like looking at it realistically, idealistically, and logogrammically, and trying to gain as much as we can, we should think of numbers as, she says, they're like entities. They're like, she says in, I think it's in the key transactions, that their numbers are like entities. They're not just, you know, not just symbols, but they stand for real powers, real things, real abilities, and there's ways to correlate. And then the tetrad comes from this, the pyramid, which she said was, and the ancient Egyptians, you know, fire comes from that, and the different elements, and somehow from fires produce water, which makes the cube, and, you know, that's on the physical plane, the water, but it's a physical representation of something on these higher planes as well. And there's different groupings. We really have to think of it as a gem with different facets, depending on how you turn it. Which one is brightest in that moment? There's that aspect to this wisdom. And then she says that man is the star. He's the 5-pointed star, because we have the five senses, the 5 lighting up of mind, the 5th principle. So, but we're progressing to understanding our full 7-fold nature. Some of it is latent. It's not that it's not there. It isn't expressed. Its potential. It's
there's an article in 5 Years of Theosophy by Subaru about the zodiac and the numbers in it. Perhaps
that would
the
be helpful
student
too.
would be able to read it. It's very useful.
Yeah.
There's a quick comment and then a question. There's a little clue about how water comes from fire if you look at the etymology of hydrogen, right? Because hydrogen, of course, is extremely flammable, but the root is hydro, which is water, but
Sure.
then you have gen, meaning it's when hydrogen is ignited, the result is water. It's a water generator, essentially. And then there may be some clue in there as well with oxygen, which is like acid generator, and carbon and nitrogen. Like there's some interesting, deeper meaning to all of those in terms of when they were first named and what the etymology of those words is. The question I had was that in an article on, it's one of the New Year's articles, HPB says that, she says sarcastically that Theosophists have been kindly nicknamed sevening lunatics. And I wonder if we could take something like this too far. Obviously 7 is meaningful, it has its mystical, value, and it's key to the philosophy in so many ways. But should it affect, like, if we're buying bananas, should we buy the bunch that has 7 bananas? How far do we take it? No, because we know that nothing is meaningless, right? We know that even in the smallest detail of our lives, there is something important. So there's nothing by coincidence or accident. So, what's your take on that?
When it comes to the bananas, I guess the student would say that everything matters much more than we think it does, and also much less than we think it does. Yeah, we could take it too far. I think as long as one tries to correlate it with the principle behind it, what the essence of the number means. If we can come to an understanding of that, if we leave it on the plane of ideation and motive, that seems to be the safest bet than to do everything physical in terms of 7s, like buying bananas or there may be something to it. The student doesn't know for sure, but sure, anything can be taken too far. I think one has to understand the spirit of it. And just to add, the student remembered that 6 is the interlaced triangles. It's 2 sets of 3, and then the 7 is the one within, this, like this, the point within. But there's also a 7-sided figure, and there is much to study. And I guess the student would encourage one to just really search for those origins, like trace it back, like she's done, to find out as much as one can, and weigh it against, common sense in one's mind, and see where it sets right. Certainly, everything is based on vibration, and the universe came into being through number, she says, I think in Transactions, through number. So it's a structure. And if we think of like these shapes as 3-dimensional structures, it's ordered. It tells us something greater, that there's an order, there's a purpose, there is meaning. But we have to be careful what we assign, how we assign meaning. it should be based on, you know, something philosophical or, you know, mindful principles. Exactly. Yeah. So I guess our time is up. With that, we'll end with Y7, and next week is
Three
the
kinds of
the
faith.
3 kinds of faith, and we'll be happy to carry on the discussion more about 7 or any of these principles after.